welcome to another adventure in Australian literature. This week we have a favourite on this channel. We have another David Malouf. You know we always enjoy a good David Malouf. And this week we are having a look at An Imaginary Life, another of his novels that has absolutely nothing to do with Australia and yet somehow does. So, but before we start with that, remember there is our shop where we have books and we have writing services. Check that out. All sorts of good things there. We also have our Redbubble shop where we have over 100 designs. And it's my birthday next week, so you want to support us? That's a great way to support us, is coming across and getting something from the Redbubble shop. Alternately, you don't want to spend money but you still want to support us? That's fine. Like, subscribe, comment, share, all of those things help us. So, what have we got? We have got An Imaginary Life. Now, this is one of my Christmas books. I got this for Christmas. And it's a book that I have actually wanted to have a read of. That's why I got it for Christmas. But I sort of delayed reading it because we were waiting for Poor Things. This is actually probably going to be a shorter video because Poor Things was so huge. But this is the story of the ancient Roman poet Ovid's Exile on the far end of the empire, out in the boondocks, or as the late great Barry Humphries would say, the arse end of the world, to give it an Australian feel. So he has been exiled out to the edges of the empire for offending Augustus. Augustus being very famously quite conservative. His rule as emperor is quite conservative. We don't actually know exactly what annoyed Augustus enough to exile Ovid out to the boondocks, but we know it was something, and we know a bit about his exile, not much, because he wrote a series of letter poems called the Tristesse, 5 different long letter poems in which he, complains about everything and does give a little bit of the world that he is exiled to, which is what David Malouf used to create the tribal society that exists in this novel. So he's using Ovid's own observations of these people to give it a certain weight. This book is in it's a first person, so we are getting Ovid's account of his exile. At first it is an utterly silent exile because he speaks Latin and not the language of these barbarians. So he is now all of a sudden rendered mute, as so many of the humans in his Metamorphosis, which is probably where everybody knows Ovid from, is his Metamorphosis, where so many humans in the Metamorphosis are rendered mute, unable to speak, unable to connect with the world that they find themselves in. So most of the first part of the book is focused on that. So the first 2 books of this. By about the 3rd book, we start to meet a wild child who Ovid sees when he's out on a deer hunting expedition with the men of the village. This wild child captivates his imagination, and he persuades the people to bring the wild child into the village. Now, this, I won't spoil the ending of it for you, but this is the big thing of the book. this contact between Ovid and this wild child. The villagers are quite afraid of the wild child. They're not quite certain what he is. There is an element towards the end that made me think very much of Thomas Mann and Death in Venice. But what David Malouf is doing is imagining his way into this world. This is an imaginary life, not only because Ovid imagines himself into the child, David Malouf is imagining himself into Ovid, and also the fact that Ovid has an imaginary life as a writer. That's what a writer does, is have an imaginary life. Now, at the opening of the book, he is still writing. He's still writing this long poem and sending letters back to Rome, begging forgiveness of, please, I'm very sorry. But eventually he does come to decide, this is where I am now. And he does make peace with this. And that's really interesting because he's able to imagine himself into living out the end of his life in this place. From going from somebody who couldn't imagine a world without Rome, a young man who is so desperate to get to Rome, get to the capital, to do something other than live the life of a provincial landowner that his father expects him to be, but to go to Rome. Of course, going to Rome leads to this level of ruin, this impulsiveness, this refusal to do what is expected. His impulsiveness and his refusal to just keep your head down and don't make any waves leads to a crisis within the village in which he is exiled. So Ovid is a man who, even encased in silence, even forced out of the world that he knows, cannot deny him himself. There is no point lamenting whatever he had done to get exiled in Rome, because that same quality of him is there in the village on the edge of nowhere. It is the same element that is what drove him to Rome in the first place. So it's David Malouf, so obviously the writing is gorgeous. It's not a long read. It's only about 150 odd pages. So it's actually the kind of book you can read in either a couple of short sittings or one really long sitting wet afternoon type of book. So, Ancient Rome. How on earth is this an Australian book? How could we possibly? Well, we are a country that is out in the middle of nowhere. We are, for most of our history, we have been very cut off from what is, for Westerners, the equivalent of Rome, from Europe, from America. We have always been very far away. We've been very far away from the colonial powers that settled Australia. We've been very far away from England. So we are out at the edges of the universe. We're at the edges of the empire. We're at the edges of the world. But that's not just what it is. But Australia has had, not only has it been a colonised country, it is a country that people have migrated to. People have chosen or been forced to come to Australia. And in coming to Australia, people have, especially, and I was thinking of this when I was reading it. This is very much a story that talks to a migrant experience, a migrant experience that David Malouf does not have. David Malouf is his family were from Australia. His mother had migrated to Australia in 1913 when she was 10, and his father was born here. His Lebanese Christian father was born here. His grandparents had come to Australia in the 1880s, his Lebanese grandparents. And David Malouf recalls as a small child hearing his Lebanese grandfather, who he did not believe spoke any English, talking to his friends and telling stories, and that sense of, I know what you're talking about, as in, I know this is a story, I can understand the cadences of story, but I do not know the words of this story. Of course, this is, David Malouf as a small child in the 1930s is coming from an Australia where multiculturalism is not a thought of thing. That won't happen till the 70s, where migrants are expected come, assimilate, and become exactly like everyone else. And while this was probably less difficult if somebody had migrated from a English-speaking country, England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, this stark lack of accommodation for non-English speaking migrants left them in exile, whether it was chosen exile or not. So Australia has always had migrants from non-English speaking backgrounds, whether it is Irish convicts who did not speak English but spoke Gaelic, whether it is German, Chinese and Italian and Lebanese and Afghan, though the Afghans actually come from numerous different places in the world, in the Middle East and South Asia. The Afghans were not Afghans specifically. It's fascinating history to look into. Whether it was the camel herders who created the ability to travel and establish communities across some of the vast deserts that in Australia. I mean, you know, Broken Hill is incredibly remote. It's closer to Adelaide than it is to Sydney. So some of these expanses in Australia are huge. And these are all non-English speaking peoples. These are all non-English speaking peoples who were forced to assimilate to the English speaking majority. These are all people who also found that they had to create community within each other. Why? Because exile and silence is lonely. Exile and silence is unbearable for humans. We are incredibly social creatures. We need other people. And so David Malouf's novel is talking of those exiles, those people who have either chosen or been forced to come to Australia. Of course, when we think more of non-English speaking migrants to Australia, generally for the majority of Australians, we look at the post-war migration, the large influx of people from war-torn Europe who came to Australia. Again, people who didn't have huge amounts of choice about where they went, but they knew that they could not stay where they were because of the poverty and the just the destruction that had been caused by the war, the change of politics, all sorts of things that made home no longer safe. And so he talks about the exiles' isolation, their loneliness, their need to not only connect with each other, but also to then connect with the community that is already there. Ovid has to connect with the villagers. He has to learn their language. They don't learn his. There is in this also that stubbornness of the majority to not bend. It is the thing in Australia that gets quite ugly. Well, if they want to be here, they should speak English. The sort of really nasty, ignorant rhetoric that you see that comes out of, I'm going to say it, Pauline Hanson and that ilk, the One Nation-y supporters, the people for whom assimilation is still, this should be the policy, everyone should become like us. And I think part of the thing that makes that so desolate, it's such a desolate notion, is what are you offering? What are you offering? Ovid is here in this barren place with among illiterate peoples, with who for a Roman these are barbarians. These are barbarians. What do they have on the surface to offer him in exchange for his Roman identity? And that's a really interesting idea. Is someone going to come into your community if you have nothing to offer them as a not even a replacement, but as a substitution, as a thing to substitute what they would lose by not taking it? Ovid in this has no choice. He has no choice. He is alone. He has to take what he's got. But even then, his subversive nature really can't help coming out. He plants a flower garden, which they find utterly bemusing. He dangerously challenges the world that they live in by bringing in the wild boy. They know the boy is out there in the forest. They know he's there. They have no desire to bring him into the village. That's not something they want. They're not sure what he is, a wild animal, a god, something, but not us. Not us, we don't want him. And so I think this is an interesting book in terms of adding another voice to that migrant voice, but it's a different sort of migrant voice. David Malouf is not a migrant. David Malouf comes from either Australian born or people who come from the seed country that the colony came from, as in England, and therefore are not so alien in Australia. And yet David Malouf, Lebanese heritage, gay, these things do set David Malouf, just as they set Patrick White, sexuality, out from the bulk, the mass of Australian society. There is something that David Malouf, Patrick White, a lot of our great authors understood as sitting slightly outside of the popular culture, and therefore being able to comment on that and being able to understand what must it be like, what on earth must it be like to come from a completely different culture into this world. A book that it would probably be quite interesting to read alongside this is They're a Weird Mob, which I've already done a video on. They're a Weird Mob. They're a Weird Mob is an offer of come and join us, but an imaginary life is I need to be able to see myself here before I can join you, because if you don't have anything to offer me, I can't join you. I can't come in We need to be able to imagine ourselves there. And otherwise we remain exiles. Ovid begins to imagine himself in this village and ceases to be as much of an exile, though he never gains full acceptance, partly because he's subversive, which explains how he got exiled in the first place from Rome, partly because his subversiveness disappointed his father. All of these things that mean that he is always going to find a way to exile himself until he finds a place where he is at peace. Exactly how that happens, again, David Malouf has to imagine his way into that, and I won't spoil the end of the book. But yeah, it's not such a long video this week. It is a beautiful little book. It is a beautiful little book. I absolutely recommend it, but I recommend everything David Malouf writes because he's a brilliant writer. So again, another Australian book that has nothing to do with Australia for David Malouf, but yet somehow does, much the same way Ransom does. Next time I bring you a David Malouf, I will bring you something that's actually set here. But that's all there is for this week. Do check out An Imaginary Life. I think perhaps for some people it may have been spoiled a bit by being stuck on the HSC list. It was an advanced HSC, and for some reason it was paired with William Wordsworth, and I when I saw that I thought, what? How on earth? And I think it had to do with the fact that there's a lot of nature writing in here. They're not at all the same. This is nothing like the lyrical ballads, and it's nothing like romantic writing. This is very contemporary Australian writing. So I would hate for people to have been put off by a poor experience having to study this, because it is a beautiful work. Once you've read this, do go and have a look at Ovid's actual poems. He tells you which ones they are that he used in the back of in the notes, in the afterwards, because that just gives you a different view of things. But anyway, that's An Imaginary Life. I will see you again later with another adventure in Australian literature, and Her Infernal Majesty will be along next week, and she is absolutely stepping on my toes with Summer of the 17th Doll. I don't know quite how I feel about this, but look out for her next week. Anyway, bye-bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.